Hey everybody, this video is called The Laws Continue, and today we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of Deuteronomy, looking at the 25th chapter, where in the law of Moses here, we're going through many different laws in Deuteronomy. And so we're going to look at verses 1 through 3, starting out in chapter 25 today. It says, if there is a dispute between men and they come into court, and the judges may judge them, and they justify the righteous and condemn the wicked, then it shall be, if a wicked man deserves to be beaten, that the judge will cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence, according to his guilt, with a certain number of blows. 40 blows he may give him, and no more, lest he should exceed this, and beat him with many blows above these, and your brother is humiliated in your sight. So, corporal punishment is often practiced today in some Middle Eastern countries. Corporal punishment isn't something brand new today. It was been going on since the Mosaic time here that we could see. And it was for crimes that were committed, and it was to be fairly carried out in the presence of judges. And it was limited to 40 stripes. And God considered that some criminals are wicked and deserve to be beaten, and that's what I get out of this. And corporal punishment was carried out in front of judges to ensure that the punishment wasn't excessive, because oftentimes as mankind we can seek excessive punishment, and some people would probably beat somebody to death through this way if they could. And, that's why 40 was a designated number. And now 40 was a very popular number in the Bible. It was a number of completion. And in verse 4 it says, you should not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. So a worker must be allowed to enjoy the fruit of his own labor. And the law simply commanded the humane treatment of a working animal. And as I said back in chapter 22, I think it was now, God cares about the kindness that we have for animals. In verse 5 through 10, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn son that she bears will succeed in the name of his dead brother, that is, his name may not be blotted out of Israel. But if the man does not want to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to raise up a name to his brother in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. If he stands firm and says, I don't want to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the presence of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, spit in his face, and answer and say, so it shall be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. And his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him who has his sandal removed. So it's a very interesting law here. Many people today would go crazy if this was still in practice among us. But levirate marriages, they provided that the dead man's brother the man who died childless, his brother was to go on and take his wife, marry her as the widow, in order to provide an heir. And these were not mandatory marriages in Israel, but they were applied as strong options to brothers who shared the same estate. And obviously the brother had to be unmarried, because we already know that God has condemned polygamy. So in this case, if the man's brother is already married, he wasn't to leave his wife to go with his brother's, widow, to clarify that. And, so the brother had to be unmarried and desired to keep the property in the family by passing it on to a son, as seen back in the book of Leviticus chapter 18 verse 16 and Leviticus 20 verse 21, where adultery with a living brother's wife was also forbidden. And though it was not mandatory, this practice reflected brotherly affection, and if a single brother refused to conform to this practice, then he would be confronted with contempt and humiliated by the elders. And the preservation of the name as a family member of the covenant people witnessed to the dignity of the individual. And since Numbers 27 verse 4 to 8 gave the daughters the right of inheritance when there were no sons in the family, it is reasonable to read no child rather than no son back in verse 5 when it said, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man should not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go in her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of the husband's brother to her. So a living brother in verse 9 says, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the presence of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, spit in his face, and answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. So a living brother who refused the responsibility, as we see in verse 9, shows that the widow removing his sandal and spitting in his face, that's how he would be humiliated. In verse 11 and 12 gets even more interesting here. And as I said in chapter 23, there's many times when you're going through Deuteronomy, you're going to be like, what am I reading? But verse 11 and 12 says, if two men fight together and the wife of one draws near to rescue her husband from the hand of the one attacking him and puts out her hand and seizes him by the genitals, then you shall cut off her hand. Your eye shall not pity her. So the consequence of the immodest act was only an example given to us of mutilation in the Bible as punishment in the Pentateuch. And there are a couple arguments regarding why was there such severe punishment called for? Why should a woman get her hands cut off for defending her husband by grabbing his opponent by, the private parts? And the law likely arose from the desire to protect the reproductive organs, and therefore remove anything that might prevent a man leaving descendants, because we know from Genesis 1:27 that maybe it's 1:28 I'm trying to think of here, but we know it is God said, go and be fruitful. So God tells mankind to go repopulate. In verse 13 through 16 says, you should not have in your bag different weights, a heavy and a light. You should not have in your household different measurements, a large and small. You shall have a perfect and just weight, a perfect and just measure, that your days may be lengthened in the land which the Lord your God has given you. For all who do such things, all who behave unrighteously, are an abomination to the Lord your God. So the weights and measures of trade were to be kept fairly so that people were not cheated on. And obedience means prosperous years in the land. And, talking about weights and scales, there are, I believe every state has inspectors, like in the grocery stores, they go in periodically and they check to make sure, that the weights and scales are not being cheated, because you can cause things to weigh when they don't really weigh that much to charge more. So that's why weights and measures are important, because if somebody's tampering with a calibrated scale, then you could overcharge somebody for something they're not getting. In verse 17 through 19, to wrap up the chapter here, it says, remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you were coming out of Egypt, how he met you on the way and attacked your rear ranks, all the stragglers at your rear when you were tired and weary, and he did not fear God. Therefore it shall be, when the Lord your God has given you rest from your enemies all around in the land which the Lord your God has given you to possess as an inheritance, that you will blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven, and you shall not forget. So the admonition to remember the treachery of the Amalekites was repeated here to the new generation of Israel. And later on in the book of 1 Samuel 15, Israel carries out an execution of this command. But back in Exodus 17, it recorded that the Amalekite attack on the Israelites. And unfortunately, King Saul, 400 years later, failed to completely destroy the Amalekites, which would cost him the throne. And so to wrap up our study for today, we're going to try to keep this shorter. Most of them, go up to about a half hour. But we looked at two more laws that protected criminals and animals as a limit on what you can do to them, what you can put on for corporal punishment. And the government is responsible, as the Apostle Paul says in Romans 13:4, to punish wrongdoers. And unfortunately, we seem to have a justice system today that considers itself more compassionate and kind than God himself is. Yet, we can't say that we live in a more just land or a safe society. Look at weak courts in a community and you'll see a higher crime rate. Look at weak courts and weak judges in, any given area, you're going to see more violent crimes, more homicides, all that stuff. And 40 lashes was the maximum punishment. So we see that even what seems harsh here, there was a max that was the max that they could carry out, was 40. And I want to look at 2 Corinthians 11:24. So 2 Corinthians 11:24 here, it says, "From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. So the Apostle Paul, he listed that he received 39 strikes on separate occasions as part of his apostolic credentials. And the Jews only allowed 39 lashes to be administered, and part of it was to show mercy, but it was strictly kept the law in the event of a miscount, because there was not to be a miscount. Miscounts were never going to be justified, so they would go with 39 in case if they missed one in count, and hopefully they didn't miss 2. And we looked at the command not to muzzle the ox, and who quoted verse 4 in his writings. And if you want me to go back, I will. So Deuteronomy 25:4 as a refresher on the verse, because I'm throwing trivia at you. It said, "You should not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain." So who quoted that in the New Testament, and why would they quote that? And I'll give you a few seconds here to think off the top of your head. The Apostle Paul, you have it. So Paul is the right answer in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 9 and 10. It says here, "For it is written in the law of Moses, you should not muzzle an ox while it treads out of the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be a partaker of his hope." So, Paul applied verse 4 when he's speaking in chapter 9 of 1 Corinthians, the principle to ministers' right to be supported by the people that he ministers to. And that is the real point that God was making there in verse 4. Moses also covered the 2 laws dealing with family matters, such as a marriage obligation of surviving brothers. And a Levirate marriage wasn't new to Israel. It was also practiced, as I believe I mentioned before, through the pagan nations like the Hittites and the Assyrians. And there's even ancient history that goes as far back to India, Africa, and South America. And the Sadducees, they challenged Jesus on the Levirate law, when they challenged in Luke 20, verse 27 through 40, when they were bringing up the discussion on the resurrection. And we saw the law where wives were forbidden to interfere in their husbands' fights. And the reason for those laws, and it might upset some people, the reason for those laws is because reproduction is very important to God. God said, go and be fruitful and multiply. So that's why I am very anti-abortion, because children are a gift from God. And so Moses, he also covers the two laws commanding justice through weights and measures, just being just. And God commanded Israel to justly destroy the Amalekites. And that's going to wrap up this video today. We'll see you next, as we're going to look at presenting first fruits and tithes. And we'll be in that chapter for 26 on Thursday night. So hope you have a great week up ahead. God bless, and we'll see you then.